Evening, friend. Settle wherever the day has left you. A dark road, a kitchen chair, the edge of sleep. The lamp is lit here, and everything else out there can wait until morning. Before the story, the one promise this show keeps. No advertisements live here, tonight or any night after. An hour built for rest cannot keep breaking that rest to sell you things. Nearly everyone has worked a shift that turned one last ordinary hour, the drive home already half planned, until something arrived that no training ever covered. That is what happened to 8 people aboard a 30-minute flight from Portland to Seattle on the evening before Thanksgiving in 1971. Odds are, this story has reached you before. What never made the journey, I would guess, is a single one of their names. So we begin where they did, at an airline counter in Portland on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon with nothing yet to notice. Sometime in the middle of that afternoon, a man in a dark business suit approached the Northwest Orient counter in Portland and paid $20 in cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle. He offered the name Dan Cooper. Witnesses would later strain to furnish anything sharper than the suit itself. Mid-40s, white shirt, a black clip-on tie, sunglasses, a briefcase in one hand, and an attaché case in the other. A description that fits 1,000 men on any Wednesday of that decade. His seat was the last row of the cabin. Before the airplane had moved an inch, he ordered a bourbon and soda. To this day, the bureau keeps his ticket stub. Hold that scene exactly as it appeared, because appearance is all it ever surrendered. For 20 minutes it resembled nothing: a tired salesman, a cheap fare, a drink before takeoff. For the following 50 years, the opening frame of something magnificent, the unremarkable man, the borrowed name, the seat where nobody sits, the drink, the patience, a clean opening, cinematically clean. That is the version the country chose to keep. What the record keeps is thinner. Behind the man at the counter stretches no past at all, no earlier sighting, no name that survives checking, no history a file could hold. As far as the documented world is concerned, he begins at the moment the money crosses the counter. 6 hours of recorded existence, bracketed on either side by nothing. 50 years of biography have been proposed for that blankness. A childhood here, a service record there, a quiet retirement somewhere warm. All the record itself offers is a suit, a drink, and a stub. So how was any of that possible? Because nothing he did at that counter broke a single rule of the world he did it in. In 1971, an American airport ran on almost perfect trust. Cash bought a ticket, any name served, and searching a passenger was a courtesy he might grant, never a demand he had to meet. Screening existed, a written profile, a magnetometer, but as an offer, not a requirement, reaching roughly 1 passenger in 100 of the 500,000 who boarded each day. One airport, New Orleans, had chosen to screen everyone since the summer of 1970. Everywhere else, the door stood open, for the simple reason that nobody in authority had yet imagined closing it. Authority itself existed too, 13 years of it. President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aviation Act in August of 1958, creating, that day, the Federal Aviation Agency, a body that would not become the administration until 1967. And by the last day of that year, the new agency was running the sky. 13 years of jurisdiction then, over every runway this man crossed. What it lacked was never power. It lacked the premise. The idea that an ordinary traveller with cash in his hand, bound somewhere for the holiday, was a thing to be searched. That idea belonged to the future, and nights like this one are how it got there. One more feature of that trusting world mattered above all the rest, and it was bolted to the aircraft itself. Boeing's 727 carried its own staircase, a set of steps folded into the underside of the tail, designed so the jet could serve small airfields with no ramps of their own and operable from inside the cabin. Here was an airliner in ordinary daily service that a person could walk out of, in the air. Nobody had considered that a danger for the sensible reason that nobody had yet met the passenger who would. Hijacking itself was close to routine. Between 1968 and 1974, American aircraft were seized roughly 130 times, while worldwide, somewhere on Earth, it happened about every 5 days. Out of that frequency, the industry had settled a doctrine, accommodation. Give the man what he asks, put the wheels back on the ground, argue about it afterwards. Nobody aboard Flight 305 improvised a philosophy that night. The calm that runs through the rest of this evening was training, not temperament, which I find more moving, not less. Now, the name, because the myth's first ingredient was a mistake, and the mistake was nobody's plan. On the night itself, a Portland reporter named James Long was working the telephone against a deadline, and the line to his airline contact was bad, the way long distance could be bad in 1971. Half words, guesses, static standing in for consonants. Somewhere inside that noise, Dan Cooper became D.B. Cooper. In the same building, a wire service reporter named Clyde Jabin picked up the initials and put them out to the whole country before morning. There was even a real D.B. Cooper, a Portland man who genuinely carried those initials, checked by agents that same night and cleared within hours. His clearing never caught up with the name. Long carried the slip through the rest of his career. Asked about it at last, 45 years on, he offered no varnish at all. "It was my mistake," he said. Hold on to the order of events there, because it is the whole anatomy of a legend in a single evening. Before the country knew what had happened, it knew a name, and the name was wrong. Already, the story was travelling faster than its facts. Which brings us, at last, to the people the story never bothered to name at all. 6 of the 8 wore Northwest Orient's uniform. In the cabin, 3 women worked the evening. Alice Hancock, the purser, Florence Schaffner, 23 that autumn, and Tina Mucklow, the newest of them. 22 years old, an electrician's daughter from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, who had wanted the sky since her first flight alone at 14, wearing the uniform now for 2.5 years. Forward, behind the cockpit door, sat the flight deck, Captain William Scott, First Officer Bill Rataczak, Flight Engineer Harold Anderson. On the ground in Portland, 2 more finished the roster, Dennis Lysne, who sold the $20 ticket, and Hal Williams, who worked the gate. Before that week was out, every one of the 8 would give the Bureau a signed statement, and every one of those forms survives. Pause on that, because it is stranger than it sounds. The man they all described survives nowhere except inside their paperwork. That is the cast the legend forgot. 8 people at work, and behind them 36 passengers, most of them bound for Thanksgiving tables, a number worth holding gently now, because they will spend this entire affair being told almost nothing. A 30-minute hop at the end of long shifts, every mind already on Thursday. Keep them there all 44, because everything that follows happened to them at their jobs with no procedure for any of it. A little after 3 o'clock, minutes into the climb, the man in the last row held out a folded slip of paper to the stewardess working the aisle. Florence Schaffner was 23 that autumn, and the gesture ranked among the least remarkable of her evening. A man, a note, the practiced smile that acknowledged neither. Notes came with the job. They arrived folded into cocktail napkins, tucked beneath coffee cups, pressed into her palm at the forward door, telephone numbers, hotel rooms, invitations composed at altitude by men who would land as strangers. Paper from men was weather in that cabin. So her hand began the small journey toward her pocket, where such things went to be forgotten. It had filed 100 of them. It knew the way without her. This time, the man leaned toward her and told her quietly to look at it, and something in the quietness more than the words made her unfold the paper where she stood. What the note said was that he had a bomb. It asked her to sit beside him, and when she did, he opened the briefcase far enough to show red cylinders and wiring. The evening she had been working ended somewhere in that half-inch of open case. In its place began a different one, in which the most ordinary paper of her trade had become, between her fingers, the only warning anyone aboard would ever receive. His demands, when they came, were specific to the point of professionalism. $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, a fuel truck standing by at Seattle. Having shown one flight attendant the inside of that case, he kept the other. Tina Mucklow took the seat beside him, beside the case, closed now, which had done all the talking it would ever need to do, and from that seat she became the single channel between the back of the airplane and the front. In that seat she stayed for about 5 hours. While the money and the parachutes were assembled on the ground, the aircraft circled Puget Sound for roughly 2 hours. Held at the scale of her hands, those 2 hours offered almost nothing to see. A cigarette lit, a message taken in quietly, carried forward in a murmur, an answer carried back the same way. Whatever those hours held, lived in what they replaced. The first adrenaline had burned off somewhere over the sound, leaving in its place a tension, a substance far harder to sustain. The ordinary awful discipline of sitting beside a man with a case on his lap, minute after circling minute, behaving as though nothing beside her required any behaving at all. None of it would have photographed as anything. A young woman in an aisle seat, apparently in conversation, apparently at ease, which was, of course, the exact measure of how well the work was going. Mucklow described her job that night in words I have never been able to improve on, so I will not try. She was keeping him feeling safe, reassured, comfortable, and not detonating that bomb. As a job description for a 22-year-old on the last leg of a shift, that sentence rewards a second hearing, not talking him down, not stalling him, keeping him comfortable, because a comfortable man would not do the thing everybody aboard had most feared. There is a name for work like hers, hostage management, and she carried it alone, in the back of an airplane, out of instinct and training, for 2 hours before the wheels even touched Seattle. The country would file that night under drama, high drama at altitude, the stuff of half a century of legend. From the seat beside the case it wore a plainer shape. A shift, longer than posted, worked one relayed message, one lit cigarette, one circling minute at a time, through to the far end of the night. A few rows forward of Mucklow, in the same cabin, on the same circling airplane, sat 36 people who knew none of it. What the airline gave them was a minor mechanical delay, that sentence, and nothing after it. Most of them were simply going home for Thanksgiving. Where the back of the cabin held a man, a case, a young woman keeping him comfortable, the rows forward held only an airplane that circled for a while, a late landing, a mild irritation, a wish that somebody up front would say something more useful. Once, a few feet behind them, that case had been opened. For them, it stayed shut the whole evening, along with everything it meant. At Seattle, they were let off, knowing nothing about him at all. Released then into the ordinary evening waiting for them, with the holiday a day off, and lateness the whole of their story. I find that the saddest fact in the night, one of the least told, not because they were harmed, for they were not, but because 36 people spent 2 hours inside a genuine emergency, deliberately kept from knowing, then let go into an evening in which the worst thing that had happened to them was a delay. Some of them presumably opened a newspaper the next morning and understood, all at once, retrospectively, where they had been sitting. That lag has stayed with me, learning on Thursday what Wednesday actually was, the whole night arriving a day late, like something set aside unopened until there was time. The idea itself was not new that night, and the record is plain about where it had been. 12 days before that Wednesday, in the dark over Alberta in Canada, another airliner carried a man named Paul Sinney, who had taken it over with a shotgun and demanded to leave it by parachute, the same door out of the sky tried first by somebody else. Where his night diverged is a detail small enough to hold in one hand. A parachute harness asks for both of a man's hands. To buckle his on, at a certain point in that night's proceedings, Sinney set the shotgun down on the cabin floor, and in the interval it lay there. 3 of the crew overpowered him. One of the 3 was a flight attendant named Mary Dohe. Before any of that, she had already been offered safe conduct off that aircraft, a door of her own, standing open, out of the whole affair, with no blame waiting on the other side of it. Dohe had said no. She stayed. For that refusal, in due course, Canada decorated her. I set those 12 days beside the 24th of November the way the record sets them, side by side, as a fact, with nothing built on top. What the fact quietly removes is any notion that the later night stood alone. By the time the man in the dark suit paid his $20 in Portland, the whole design, the airplane, the parachute, the walk out into the cold, had already been attempted 12 days earlier, over another country. Once already, it had failed. That later night, the one this hour belongs to, was not the sky's first of its kind. It was merely, in every sense of the word, luckier. At Seattle, where the airplane landed at 39 minutes past 5, the exchange was made. The jet parked on a distant apron while the night's arithmetic worked itself out. What he had asked for carried up. What he would release sent down. Photographed first, the money, all 10,000 $20 bills, serial by serial, onto microfilm, an afternoon of clerical labour destined to sit in a drawer for 9 years before anyone needed it. Up the rear stairs went the sack and the 4 parachutes. Down the front steps came the 36 passengers, with Florence Schaffner among them, released into the ordinary light of the terminal. He kept only the flight deck, and Tina Mucklow. Toward 8 o'clock, 20 minutes shy of it, the airplane rose again, under instructions that described themselves. South toward Mexico City, with the flaps down, the landing gear down, the altitude held to 10,000 feet, the speed kept low. An ugly, wasteful way to operate a jet, and precisely how a man would fly one he intended to leave. A few minutes into that climb, he sent Mucklow forward to the cockpit and had her draw the curtain behind her. Nobody aboard ever saw him again. A little after 8 o'clock, over southwest Washington, in rain and full darkness, the crew felt the aircraft flex beneath them, a bump of pressure, the signature of the aft stairs, standing open to the wind, and understood, without a word between them, what had just left. That was the night, all of it, from the counter to the curtain, everything after, every book, every documentary, every certainty of the following 50 years, was argument. What the searchers found, beginning at first light, was nothing, a word this story turned out to have more use for than any other. 9 years of that word passed, until the 10th of February, 1980, when on a sandbank of the Columbia called Tina Bar, an 8-year-old named Brian Ingram, smoothing sand for a family campfire, turned up 3 rotting bundles of $20 bills beneath his forearm. Still held by their rubber bands, the bundles woke the microfilm in its drawer, serial after serial after serial. Ransom money, the only ransom money the case would ever give back. All of the man's leverage that night had lived in a briefcase, red cylinders, wiring, and nothing else anyone ever verified. Every concession already described rested on the chance that those contents were real. The money, the 4 parachutes, the 2 hours of circling, 36 passengers held in polite ignorance, a 22-year-old seated beside the case for 5 hours. The question of whether a working bomb ever occupied it remained the evening's standing one, carried unanswered out of the first hour of this story. Anybody hearing the tale arrived within seconds at the obvious next one, what became of the thing, and for once the record offered a definite place to look. Searched at Reno the aircraft truly was, the file said so in a heading. Inside the Bureau's Seattle report on the case, 336 pages of it, stood a titled section, Search of Aircraft at Reno, running from page 286 to page 292. 7 pages, assembled the way such sections were always assembled, a divider page, 5 witness statement forms, 1 page of laboratory results. Paper had kept everything else from that night, the ticket stub, the signed statements, the serial numbers on their microfilm, so here was paper keeping the search itself, form by form, inside a file that seemed to miss nothing. 6 items of physical evidence closed the accounting, lettered A through F, the clip-on tie he left behind, cigarette ends, hair. Nowhere in those pages did explosives appear. No bomb squad, no search for the device, no line recording what became of it. 6 letters, none of them his case. Missing from the record of the night, in other words, was the thing everybody aboard had spent 5 hours fearing. Care belonged precisely there, because gaps of that shape attract stories the way a lit window attracts a passerby, and this telling declined to build one. An absence in a file proved nothing hidden, it proved an absence. Dull explanations covered the silence comfortably. He carried the device out into the dark with him. He carried the case out while its contents stayed behind. Somewhere nobody catalogued. Somebody dealt with the thing that night, while the paperwork settled into some other file. Or no bomb ever existed at all. Only cylinders, wire, a steady voice. Any of those would have explained the gap. The file itself confirmed none of them. What could be stated precisely came to this. A section on searching the airplane existed. It filled pages 286 through 292, and nowhere inside those pages appeared the most feared object of the night. 50 years of readers had turned them since. The hole remained a hole. Whether the bomb was ever real stayed exactly where the whole evening had left it, open, unanswered, resting in the quiet of the archive. One number settled the folk hero question without anyone needing to raise a voice, drawn from the regulator's own filing cabinet rather than from any opinion of mine. A month later, on Christmas Eve, somebody tried it again. 17 further extortion attempts followed on American carriers inside 6 months. Across that whole wave, the trick itself, out the door with the money, away, worked exactly once, ever. That once fell in April of 1972, when a man called Richard Floyd McCoy repeated the jump. His arrest took days. His name sits in the record for the one reason that matters, because he was caught. Each one deserves a minute of its own, because the wave itself was the argument. 8 weeks afterwards, on the 20th of January, a 23-year-old named Richard LaPointe took a DC-9 out of Las Vegas on the claim of a bomb, asking $50,000, 2 parachutes, and a helmet. The Cooper shape, almost exactly, at less than 1/10 of the price. 51 passengers and 2 flight attendants went free once he held what he had asked for. By that same night, he sat in custody. 8 days after that, Garrett Trapnell seized a TWA flight from Los Angeles to New York over Chicago, having carried a .45 aboard inside the plaster cast on his arm. His price ran to $306,000, the release of 2 named prisoners, together with a formal pardon from the President of the United States. Agents retook the aircraft by force and shot him. June brought a 28-year-old called Martin McNally, who took an American Airline 727 out of St. Louis with a machine gun and secured the largest sum any of them ever secured. As he jumped, the money left without him, out of the door, away into the dark, down at last in a farm field in Indiana. Within days, he too sat under arrest. Well past these, the file ran on. One man demanded $100 million in small bills from the Supreme Court, which had refused to hear his tax case, while officials bought time by laying mail sacks stuffed with newspaper along the runway. And Sinny, the man from Alberta, 12 days ahead of all of them, had boarded, carrying a sawed-off shotgun, dynamite, a sheepskin rope, a collapsible shovel, a pup tent, candy bars, a dark blue parachute, and hiking boots before demanding $1.5 million and passage to Ireland. Those boots earn a pause. Sinny, nobody's idea of a criminal genius, had thought to bring boots. What this man was admired for stood revealed. Then, as a feat a wave of people immediately tried, one that almost none of them survived getting away with, less a masterstroke than a door somebody had noticed standing open, a door 18 more people ran at until it shut. Run through that arithmetic, the admiration came out as one working instance set against a page of arrests. Asked to supply a folk hero, the record declined. Ralph Himmelsbach, the agent who ran the investigation, gave the case the last 9 years of his career without ever finding any patience for the version the rest of us enjoy. I have always very bitterly resented this guy being considered a folk hero, he said. He was a very common, desperate criminal with nothing to be admired. Sentiment about the law had no part in that. He had spent 9 years reading the statements of the people in that cabin. There the arithmetic rested, quiet as a closed ledger. Before the arguing, though, the 4 parachutes. the single best object in the whole story, and the one that carries the argument better than any of the theorizing does. Even the number repaid attention. 4 meant 2 mains and 2 reserves, a full set for a second jumper, which stripped the ground of its one quiet counter-move, the sabotaged rig, since for all anyone below could know, he intended to strap a hostage into the spare and take her out the door with him. Nobody could assume he would jump alone. That was the reasoning of a man who had rehearsed what the other side would try. Where they came from is not what the legend implies. No airline store furnished them, no military depot. The 2 back rigs belonged to a private individual named Norman Hayden, who had bought them from an aviation surplus shop in 1968. The 2 reserves came off the shelf at Seattle Sky Sports, a shop out at Issaquah. On the night itself, the back rigs rode to the airport in a taxi, routed through the Northwest Orient freight desk, somebody's second-hand sport parachutes, in a cab, to the freight counter. A man named Earl Cossey had packed them, a junior high algebra teacher who rigged parachutes on the side, and the packing cards survive with their dates intact. Both back rigs folded by Cossey on the 21st of May, 1971, 6 months before any of this. A maths teacher creasing silk on a spring Friday, preparing, without the faintest idea, an object the country would argue over for 50 years. Then the choosing, because 4 rigs lay in front of him, and he made 2 selections. For his back, he passed over the technically better sport rig in favour of the older military-style one. For his reserve, the harness a jumper turns to when the main has failed. He picked up a classroom demonstration piece, a training rig whose ripcord connected to nothing, whose canopy had been sewn shut, a parachute that could never have saved anybody. It could never even open. It went out into the dark on his chest. Hold that reserve a moment, because the whole case fits inside it. Here was the man who understood flap settings, hostage arithmetic, the weakness of a rear staircase, who had asked for 4 chutes precisely so that none could be tampered with, walking off with a rig deliberately made useless for teaching purposes. Either he could not tell, which shrinks the mastermind considerably, or he could tell and did not care, having only ever intended to use the main. Expertise reads one way, ignorance the other, and the stitched canopy testifies for both without preference. Neither reading can be got rid of. The honest centre of the parachute question, though, is that it has never had an object attached to it at all. Nothing of his has ever surfaced. No canopy, no harness, no container, no ripcord. Searchers on the ground gave up first. Their effort ended on the 29th of November, 5 days in, with something like 1/10 of its assigned area covered. In March of 1972, the Bureau returned with hundreds of soldiers and dozens of agents, and for 18 days, those soldiers walked a grid through some of the roughest country in the American West, finding nothing whatsoever. Not him, not the parachute, not the money. When the lawmen concluded that he most likely died in the jump, and when the working skydivers answered that the jump sat inside the envelope of the survivable, the copycats having proved as much within months, both camps were reasoning from conditions and from hardware, because neither camp held anything. 2 careful arguments about an absence, conducted for 50 years. What kept the matter unsettled was never a shortage of cleverness. There was simply nothing there to be clever about. 1 canopy left sewn shut. 1 never produced at all, the unopened, twice over. And between them, the question rested exactly where it began. Open. Now, the part I had been putting off, which was the 50 years of argument. In this case, everybody had a story, literally rather than as a figure of speech. Families who were certain, books, television series, a genuinely enormous amount of careful amateur work, until every few years somebody produced a new candidate carrying a new piece of evidence. Adjudicating any of it lay beyond me, as it lay beyond everybody else. What I could trace instead was the shape the failures took, a shape so consistent that once seen, it opened the whole case. Start with the loudest. A man named Rackstraw had been pushed very hard by a book, then by a television series, in 2016, until for a while his face was everywhere. The confident chapters, the broadcast certainty, the apparatus of a solved case assembling in public. The Bureau had already cleared him. Behind that clearance sat a plain physical difficulty. At the time of the hijacking, Rackstraw was 28 years old with light eyes, set against the description of a middle-aged man with dark eyes, a description drawn from 5 separate witnesses who had shared a small space with that man for hours. Nothing subtle lived in the mismatch, so the record declined him quietly, the way a clerk declines a form filled out in the wrong ink. After Rackstraw came the deathbed cases, of which several existed. Dwayne Weber, Kenny Christiansen, Sheridan Peterson, among others. Each followed the same quiet architecture, a family, a line spoken late in life, a lifetime of small strangenesses that assembled into a pattern once somebody knew what to look for. In each of them, no forensic connection of any kind ever surfaced. Care felt necessary there, since smugness would have come cheap. Every family that believed it held the answer, was holding something real. A rig, a logbook, a father's silence, a sentence spoken in a hospital room, carried ever since. Those things were not nothing. They simply were not proof, while the distance between the two remained the entire subject of this episode. Most interesting of the names was Richard McCoy, the one man who had actually done the same thing, caught in the doing of it. In 2024, his own children, Shantae and Rick McCoy III, handed over a parachute rig, a harness, a logbook found on the family property in Cove City, North Carolina. Custody of all 3 passed to the Bureau. Since July of 2016, the public status of the case has not moved. Objects at last, real enough to hold, offered by a family in good faith, while the record sounded once more, declined once more. From the kitchen tables, then, to the laboratory bench, where the physical evidence was carrying more weight than it could bear. At the centre of it sat the tie, a promiscuous object, as evidence goes. It had lain on that seat, it had been worn, it had passed through a laboratory. What emerged was a particle profile dominated by silicon, calcium, and iron, with titanium present in far smaller proportion than the retelling suggested. A machine shop of nearly any kind threw off the same dust. A railroad's would have done it. One tie, worn, sampled once. A partial profile of DNA rode on it besides, though the Bureau's own stated position held that no evidence made the tie his at all. By that accounting, the single most examined object in the case may have belonged to somebody else entirely. After the tie came the money, the strangest argument of the lot, an argument conducted about sand. Brian Ingram, the boy who had uncovered the bundles on Tina Bar in 1980, had found them still in their rubber bands, a detail worth holding. A geologist at Portland State named Leonard Palmer read the layers of that bank. Placing the bundles above a clay layer, He connected to a dredging operation the Army Corps of Engineers had run in 1974. On Palmer's reading, the money arrived after that year, having drifted for seasons on end, except that experiments suggested rubber bands do not survive a year outdoors, let alone 8. In 2009, another team remapped the site, concluding the dredge could not have put the bundles there, while openly admitting they had no better mechanism to offer in its place. Sand, rubber bands, a boys' picnic, refusing to agree with one another for 45 years. Every person inside that argument doing careful, honest work, the record declining, all the same, to choose among them. Largest of all the disputes, and the one I found genuinely vertiginous, concerned the ground itself. The place everybody pictured may have been the wrong place. On the Bureau's map, the corridor put the jump near Ariel and Lake Merwin, which was why the divers went there, the soldiers, the small submarine. Researchers, Eric Ulis among them, argued that the published flight path was really the track of the 2 Air Force fighter jets, a pair of F-106s sent up from McCord Field, south of Tacoma, to follow the airliner. On that reading, the line on the map belonged to the chase rather than to Flight 305, with the landing far to the west near the Columbia. Such a shift would explain the money. It would also mean that 50 years of searching, digging, diving, grid walking had happened over ground he was never above. Whether those chase jets were routine in 1971 mattered for the weight that argument could carry, so I looked into it. The honest answer being that I could not establish it. What the sources showed was the era's hijackings handled by law enforcement on the ground, agents boarding at crew changes, police shooting out tires. Nothing I found confirmed fighter escort as standard practice. Neither will I claim it was not, because the absence of a source is not a fact. Settling the question would take military records that are not public, so it stays exactly as open as it deserves to be. 5 soundings in, a suspect, a family's word, a tie, a bank of sand, a line on a map. The pattern stood plain. Every single thread in this case ran the same way, a tie that could have been his or anybody's, money that had arrived somewhere it should not have, at a time it could not have, a flight path that may have been somebody else's flight path altogether. Picked up by one end, the sewn-shut reserve proved expertise. Picked up by the other, ignorance. Even the claim that he must have known the airplane, the foundation under every inside man theory, turned out to be contested, since flight attendants worked those stairs routinely during boarding. The operating instructions stood printed on a placard beside the mechanism, while any passenger who had ever flown a 727 could have watched the whole procedure done. Which brought the evening to the sentence it had been walking toward, put better by the research than by me, so I borrowed its shape. The more expertise credited to him, the likelier he lived. The less, the likelier he died. No third thing remained to weigh. No object left to test, nothing in an evidence room that decided it. 50 years of answers had come in, each certain at its own kitchen table, until the record, having declined every one of them, left them all a single shape, the shape of not knowing. The mastermind and the fool were the same man in the same seat, and after 50 years, the record had still not chosen between them. A microscope had the last serious word on this case on the 3rd of August, 2020, in a journal called Scientific Reports. Tom Kay and Mark Meltzer had gone looking at what was living on the money. Diatoms are single-celled algae in glass shells, so ordinary in river water that a scrap of anything held under the lens turns into a crowded little landscape. Each genus rising and falling on a schedule a person can read like a calendar. Asterianella was the genus the Tana Bar bills carried, a bloom that crowds the Columbia in May and June. What those bills lacked was the assemblage that winter water leaves behind. Those bundles entered that river during a summer bloom, then, rather than on a night of rain in November. Somewhere between the moment the aft stairs came down over southwest Washington and the day the cache met that water, something held it, somewhere out of that water for months, where it sat, in whose keeping, the algae declined to say. This finding is checkable, which is more than most of the case can offer, so the verdict its authors wrote on their own work has stayed with me. Their study, they said, does not bring forth any new theories. Careful people, real instruments, a genuine result, summarized by the very people who produced it as explaining nothing, narrowed and enlarged in the same breath. This whole affair in miniature, which is why the ending here strikes me as unusually truthful rather than unsatisfying. 50 years of retelling have run on the opposite instinct. We would rather have a story than an open question. A man who beat the odds is a story. A man who probably came down in the dark over forest is only a fact. Nobody has to behave badly for the smoothing to happen. It happens in newsrooms, in living rooms, one telling at a time, each version a little rounder than the one before. The misheard name is the tell. Half a century of folklore rests on a bad telephone line, on two initials a wire reporter carried out to the country before morning, on the plain circumstance that nobody ever went back to fix it. That is not a case being hidden. That is a story being preferred. In July of 2016, after 45 years, the Bureau moved its resources elsewhere. Not a closing, not a ruling that the thing could never be answered, but a shelf. Everything stayed where it was, evidence preserved, door left open, while the working hours went to cases with living witnesses. Deprioritized is the word for it. Quieter and sadder than unsolved, though nearer the truth than either. I will leave it then, not with him, since he is the least interesting person in it. I will leave it on the evening before Thanksgiving, 1971, on a 30-minute flight from Portland to Seattle, that everybody aboard expected to be over almost before it began. A young woman with a folded slip of paper in her hand, wondering whether it was worth unfolding. Another young woman settling into the seat beside that closed case, keeping a stranger comfortable for 5 hours, because comfort was what would keep everyone alive. 3 men on a flight deck flying badly on purpose. 2 more in Portland who had sold a ticket and opened a gate. Men who would spend the rest of that week describing a face to the Bureau. 36 people, a few rows forward, mildly put out about a delay, going home. Not a legend. A workplace, on a Wednesday, with everybody thinking about Thursday. What survives of the man himself is paper. A $20 stub for a one-way seat to Seattle, still in the Bureau's keeping, joined now by a peer-reviewed page honest enough to say it settled nothing. Thank you for spending this hour with me, and with them. Whether it kept company on a long road, or filled a quiet evening somewhere, or carried the last soft distance down towards sleep, that was the whole of what it was for. Enough on its own. Nothing here needs settling tonight. The question has sat where it sits for more than 50 years, perfectly comfortable, and will keep till morning without any help from us. Rest easy now, wherever this finds you, and until next time, friend, go gently. the light will keep.